So welcome to those joining on the recording and for all those joining live again. You're on the first in a series of online events being run by the Network of Wellbeing and Eden Project Communities, which is exploring how community action can support wellbeing. We're so excited about different perspectives and angles. This evening we're going to be focusing on kinder relationships and addressing loneliness and building communities, and this evening's event is also part of the Leeds Festival of Kindness, Compassion and Wellbeing, and their theme today, which is kinder relationships, which we'll hear a little bit more about in a minute. But we're going to have two further events in this series, which you'll have seen in the kind of confirmation email, and I'll mention a little bit more about later this evening. But without further ado, I'll just remind you briefly to mute yourselves if you're not speaking, just so that we don't get any background noise. And to start with, we're going to have two main speakers this evening, but before I hand over to Tracy and Iona, our speakers, and introduce them, I'm going to just hand over to my colleague at the Network of Wellbeing, Josh Malkin, who also has been supporting the Leeds Festival, and he can tell us a little bit more about the festival and the theme for today. So over to you for a minute, Josh.
Thanks, Flo. Welcome everybody. Today is Kinder Relationships Day at the Leeds Festival of Kindness, Compassion and Wellbeing. Network of Wellbeing is a partner of the festival because we see kindness and compassion as the ground in which personal, public, community, societal and environmental wellbeing can flourish. And we're really hoping that the festival can be a way of linking together the many amazing community initiatives for creating a kinder world, and this well-being, this webinar will be hopefully a significant contribution to that. The themes of the festival have been kindness to self, because we can't give unless we look after ourselves, kinder relationships, kinder communities, kinder business, kindness to the environment and kinder spaces. And the week's festival will be followed by catalyst events from practitioners in their different fields. Anyway, welcome to the festival, and welcome to those who are joining from the festival and to everyone else. And I'll hand back now to Flo.
Thanks so much, Josh. And yeah, really recommend those that hadn't heard of the festival before to check out the range of events on offer throughout this week, and like Josh mentions, later throughout the month as well. We will send details about that in the follow-up email for those that aren't aware of where to find the information. So before I introduce our first speaker, Tracy, I'd love to just, well, we all wanted to just find out a little bit more about the audience and kind of connect with you guys. So I'm actually going to share a poll question that hopefully you see pop up on your screens now. Actually two questions. So as you know, as has been mentioned, this webinar is focusing on kinder relationships, addressing loneliness and building communities. So we really wanted to find out, do you think loneliness is getting more widespread in our societies? And have you spoken to any of your neighbours in the last week? So from the kind of macro like society-wide perspective to kind of, yeah, what's your day-to-day connection like with those around you? So I'll just give you guys a few seconds to complete your opinions in that poll, and then I'm going to end the poll and I'm going to share the results with you guys. So I'll end it now. So really not necessarily unexpected on the first question. 82% of people think yes, 16% of people are unsure. This is a topic that Tracy is going to go into a bit more in terms of loneliness in society. And in terms of speaking to your neighbours, 71% of you have and 29% of you haven't. Great. We'll hopefully have a chance to delve into those topics with each other in more detail in the breakout rooms, because I know it can be really interesting to kind of share in more depth with each other what kind of connection and kindness looks like in your own community. But for now, I'm going to introduce our first speaker to give us a really good overview, and that's Tracy Robbins from Eden Project Communities. So Tracy manages the UK-wide delivery team at Eden Project Communities, and she's really passionate about communities and informal networks, relationships and interconnectedness, and really reducing loneliness. So this is something that Tracy really is very engaged with, and I know that she's really excited to share with you all this evening. So I'll hand over to you, Tracy.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming to spend such a dedicated amount of time. She didn't give me any extra time to touch on whether it's got more widespread or not, so I might have to go over. But thank you for welcoming me, and for me it's really important to be part of the Leeds Festival, because I am a Leeds lass, although hiding up in Cumbria. Am I very quiet? Oh, that's no good. Can you hear me now? Is that a bit better? Can everybody hear me? Yes? No?
Can hear you. You're just a little bit
very quiet.
Yeah.
Oh, that's not very good. Is that a bit better?
No.
Is that a bit better? Oh, someone said yes and someone said no.
No.
You might just have to speak quite loudly and close to the mic, Tracy.
I'll just take my headphones off. Is that better? Yes? Okay.
Yeah, that's great.
Let's hope the neighbours don't complain I'm loud. So I was just saying, I'm a Leeds lass at heart, although I'm hiding up in Cumbria at the moment. I'm a product of community development and was an isolated single parent in Leeds, in Middleton and Belle Isle, so South Leeds lass. And those who know what that's like know that you don't mess with us. Anyway, I'm going to talk to you today about loneliness and not about Leeds. So I've got a quick presentation to go through that hopefully you can see now. And I just wanted to explain why this is an important thing for Eden Project Communities. So Eden is down, the visitor destination down in Cornwall, but Eden Project Communities is their UK outreach programme. So Eden is all about sustainability, resilience and social action, and actually it's an educational charity, but we know human connection is at the heart of that, and actually you need human connection in order to be sustainable and more resilient to the challenges we face. So I want to talk about loneliness, and those who might have heard me speak before will know that I think it's really important to break down exactly what loneliness is, because it's quite a complex issue. So for me, loneliness is that mismatch between the relationships you have and those you want. So you'll often hear people say it's about the quantity and quality of your relationships, but it is that mismatch. So you can have lots of relationships, but if they're not the ones you want and the ones you need, it could still leave you feeling with a sense of loneliness, and often then a sense of guilt or a feeling that there's something wrong with you because you're not getting what you need from those relationships you have. The biggest thing, if you take anything away with you today, is it is an ordinary emotion. It is our internal trigger. There is nothing to be stigmatized about being lonely. I have experienced loneliness numerous times and have periods during lockdown, particularly because I'm a hugger and I miss people. So if you think, when we're thirsty, that's our body telling us we need a drink, or we will die of thirst. When we're hungry, that's our body telling us that we need to eat to nourish and sustain us. Loneliness is exactly the same thing. It's that sort of, I was going to say prehistoric, I don't know what the real word is, but it's that inbuilt internal trigger saying, actually, we're a social species and we need each other to survive. So it's our internal trigger, it's there to protect us. Loneliness often describes the pain of being alone, whereas solitude describes the joy. And I think that's really important, because people will talk about loneliness when they're on about aloneness or isolation, and loneliness is very different. So you can feel incredibly confident and happy being by yourself and living alone and not feel lonely, and yet you can be in a relationship and feel lonely. So being alone is not necessarily a precursor to being lonely. Isolation is very different. So isolation is where there is no choice but to be alone. And I think many people have experienced that during the forced isolation of lockdown. But for some, knowing that everybody else was in the same situation has actually reassured them or made them feel better. But if you can imagine how isolation must feel when the world is on, it's real and going at a fast pace, how far left behind you feel and isolated. And many of us would seek solitude, but few of us would choose to be lonely, because it's really detrimental to our health and well-being. And you'll hear loads of stats. The 15 cigarettes a day annoys me, because I think nothing worse than 15 is 16. But it is akin to, it really makes you feel ill, because you're in self-preservation and high stress mode all the time. So you're less likely to look after yourself. You're more likely to smoke or to drink or not to exercise. And to be honest, if you feel lonely, therefore you're probably feeling neglected or unwanted or unseen or uncared for, then you stop caring for yourself. And they are the big things that make it not good for us. It gets a little bit more complicated, so I'm just going to skim through this. So loneliness is an evaluative state. So you could not say, oh, Flo looks lonely this evening, because we wouldn't know. Unless we spoke to Flo and we took time to listen, we wouldn't know. So it's how we feel, and we can't predict how others feel. So there's a social loneliness where you will have lots of connections, but actually maybe you feel you don't have that one that cares about you. And I love this example, and I'm sure we've all got a friend like that, on the phone for an hour and she never once asked how I was. That makes you feel that little bit lonely. Hopefully those situations are transient, but if they load up, they can really impact on people. Emotional loneliness is that loneliness of the heart, and it's really devastating. And I think we see this a lot in loss and bereavement and relationship breakdown. And there's that beautiful quote there where someone is saying, who's lost their partner, saying that everything I touch, everything I do, she's there. So that's that constant. If you think back to that mismatch of the relationships you have and those you want, you still want that relationship with that person you may have lost. So that's a real emotional drain on people. And then there's existential loneliness, a word I struggle to say. And that is where you really, really get into that chasm of despair. So you've got in a rut, you've been feeling lonely and isolated quite a long time, and that's where you start to think about, actually nobody would care if you were not there. And that's really, really sad. And actually we've seen some organisations I've spoke to during COVID have actually seen suicide risks increase greatly during this time, and I think it might be partly to do with this, and it might not. So that's one to be aware of. I've gone one too many, not to worry. I think the main thing I wanted to chat to you about today is this neighbourhood approach to loneliness. So if we think that actually our neighbourhoods are made up of people and connections, and that's what matters. So I have always looked at loneliness from a place perspective. So I've always done community work. I've always looked at loneliness of anyone of any age, because it's actually the connections that we have where we live that are important. And actually it's the people who we live alongside that are important. So you might have many, many connections and really strong family. But if there's a crisis, or if you need them and they're not there to support you, then you might start feeling lonely. It's really important that we make every connection and conversation count, and that we listen. So you cannot find out who is feeling lonely or hear some of the trigger things unless you're listening to people. We could all reduce the stigma of loneliness. So as I said before, it is an ordinary feeling. It is natural. It is instinctive. It is a trigger. Nobody is a nuisance or a burden. We are all, and I think if we're able to share our feelings of loneliness, we actually give people permission to share theirs. We need to continue to keep giving people reasons to connect. So this kind of Leeds Festival give people reasons to connect. Eden Project, we have a network, we do courses, we have the big lunch. So we're constantly trying to find reasons to keep people connected and to continue them keeping connected. What has been beautiful for some people during COVID is that we have been able to prioritise the time to connect with each other because we have been at home. And I think this is really, really important going forward, and about being kind to one another. There's a real thing about making sure we don't create an us and a them. So as soon as we create a group, and many of you may experience this, as soon as we create a group in our neighbourhood or a group in the community, by the very nature of creating an us, you create a them. So how do you keep that group open and involve lots of other people? And although that sense of identity might bind you together, how do you make sure other people are able to join that? I think what's really important as well is to try not say the words, so people often talk about loneliness as if we've got to tackle it, we've got to fight it, we've got to eradicate it. And if you think it's not loneliness we want to fight and eradicate, because that's our internal warning system telling us that something's wrong. It's the symptoms that cause our feelings of loneliness. And as soon as we start talking about an issue in that combative way, then people start feeling ashamed of feeling it. So it's really important that we talk about it as in it's an ordinary, everyday sort of thing.
Sorry, Tracy, you've got about 1 minute to go.
Oh. No. So we often talk about the permission of snow, and this is basically snow often gives people time and a reason to connect, and gives people permission to contact their neighbours. But what we find is when snow disappears, so does that level of caring and connection. What we've seen recently is we've had a lot of time and permission to connect through COVID, and being able to connect with our neighbours and each other over crisis. Many of us are talking about not wanting to see the tide go out so far, but already there is research to say that actually that level of connection, that level of engagement is already dropping off. So I'd like people to think about just about those people who came in to the COVID-19 situation feeling lonely and still are lonely, because not everybody has had that neighbourliness experience. Those people who are likely become or could be or have become lonely. So if we think there's stress, there's change, there's isolation, there's job losses, there's starting school, there's starting university, there's maybe having babies. These are all trigger points that we need to look out for. Those who are bereft. I mean, I think we're up to nearly 40,000 people who have just lost someone through COVID, let alone the other losses in the UK. And then there are actually a group of people who have become connected and actually feel connected in their neighbourhood, who are now fearful that they will now become lonely because people will start going back to work. The groups, the mutual aid groups and the surge of neighbourliness that came forward will now dissipate. And then how will they feel? And then there's also quite a lot of fearfulness about skill. So people feel they've lost the ability to go out, to connect with each other, and we might need to do some hand holding and buddying there. So just, I think if we can just all think about those who we care for, those who are worried about. And the main thing is we often don't ask people if they're lonely because we think we then have to solve it. And we don't. Do you know, you just ask people how they're feeling and be kind and listen. There's no silver bullet to loneliness. It's personal. What makes me feel lonely might not make you feel lonely. But we all can make a difference. And we all can make a difference by being there for each other, looking after each other, and just being kinder and trying to spend a bit more time in our relationships. I think that's all I wanted to say, and I didn't have time to say whether it's getting worse or better. So I might have to come back to that later. Thank you. I'm going to hand over to my beautiful friend now. Well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tracy, so much for that presentation. It's yeah, one thing I find on Zoom is it's so powerful to hear what you've said, and it's lovely to see it resonating so much in the chat. If people want to give a little round of applause, that's also a nice thing to do on Zoom. I give you one, either with the reactions button or with your hands, which is lovely to see. Yeah, really powerful presentation, and I see people sharing how much it's resonating with them, and that yeah, the mixed experiences people have had during lockdown, and also your point about not seeing loneliness as a battle, that loneliness is an experience we all go through, is really, really powerful and important. So thank you. And like you say, we're going to hand over to your beautiful colleague and friend now, Iona. So just to say, I noticed someone in the chat box said that, of course, we'd love to hear more from Tracy. We will be having a Q&A section, so if you've got questions that you would like Tracy to address in a bit more depth, then just write in the chat box with the word question, and my colleague Roger will keep an eye out for those, and we'll come back to them during the Q&A. So you will hear a bit more from Tracy later on. But for now, I'm going to introduce our next speaker of the evening, which is Iona Lawrence. So Iona is a freelance strategist working across the non-profit and profit sectors, really building collaborations and coalitions for change. And she, in 2016, she set up the Jo Cox Foundation in memory of her friend Jo Cox MP with her family. And as a founding director of the foundation, she brought together diverse coalitions and partnerships to campaign on the issues that Jo had championed. And I know that she's going to touch on a lot of those important issues this evening. We're really looking forward to hearing her presentation. So I'll hand over to you, Iona.
Thanks, Flo, and hi everyone. Wow, what a group for 8 p.m. on a Tuesday evening. I just went for a run and didn't time it quite well enough, so I'm still quite hot, which is like not how I should be speaking, but luckily you can't see, or you can't see close enough. So I am going to run through, building on what Tracy's so brilliantly outlined, what we can perhaps do about loneliness, avoiding language like Tracy says around tackling and beating, because it is an innate human condition and it's not something that you can just remove entirely. It's because we are social, the deficit of sociability will always leave us lonely. But I'm hopefully going to leave you with some inspiring tidbits from people across the country who are all sort of doing the sorts of things that you do in communities day in, day out to build connection and ward off loneliness. So if I share my screen, I'm going to start with a bit of a story about Jo. So if I present this. So this here is, so I, as you can hear, don't come from Leeds, but this on the left here is Jo Cox and her sister Kim on the right, who, as you will probably all know, came from not far from Leeds in Batley. And she was a friend of mine through politics and through charity work, where we'd both done some work over the years. And when she was campaigning to be an MP in Batley, she'd returned from being an aid worker overseas. So she'd not really spent very much time at home other than fleeting trips to see family for about 20 years. And as she was knocking on doors in and around Batley, she was really struck by the way in which the people answering the doors were really looking for conversations. And those weren't just people who are perhaps older, where like the stereotype might be that there were kind of people who might be lonely, who might be beyond retirement, but actually it was new parents, it was people coming in and out of work, it was carers, it was young people. And she arrived in Westminster charged with this sense that that from when she was a child, and the landscape and the community she'd known and the connections that she'd seen, particularly through the eyes of her grandfather who was a postman, that had really shifted. And she arrived in Westminster thinking, what can be done to sort of raise the profile of and ask questions about why it was that she'd witnessed so many people wanting to connect and experiencing loneliness as she'd campaigned. She went on to set up a commission on loneliness in partnership with organisations like the Eden Communities and others to try and lift the lid on loneliness and get to the bottom of it. And just before it was due to launch, she was very sadly killed, and her colleague and partner in crime from across the House, Seema Kennedy, picked up with Rachel Reeves, the Labour MP, and they picked up where Jo had left off and launched the Jo Cox Loneliness Commission, which, with the support of some brilliant organisations like the British Red Cross and Refugee Action and Action for Children, sort of campaigned and pushed government to take kind of ambitious action. And that's what resulted just a year or so after she was killed in the appointment of the Minister for Loneliness, the first of whom was Tracy Crouch, who you can see in the bottom right hand corner there. But Jo never thought that the government was going to fix the loneliness crisis. What the government can do is they can raise the profile of something and they can invest in social spaces and the social infrastructure that connects people. But at the end of the day, and as the people, all of you on this call know so well, like the reality is that the connections that we need to stay happy and healthy, that happens in communities. And that's why we, in partnership with Leeds Communities and the Big Lunch in 2017, set up the Great Get Together, which is just an excuse really for people to reach out and connect with their neighbours and celebrate what Jo believed, that we have more in common than that which divides us. So one thing that I think you should definitely go away and read, and if you can't read because you don't have time, because frankly, like lockdown hasn't left me with much time to read, go Google him and have a look at some of the podcasts he's done. This is Vivek Murthy, who used to be the Surgeon General of the US. And when he came to think about his legacy and what he was going to do as he stepped down, he never envisaged that his like retirement project would be loneliness. He thought he'd find some sort of clinical breakthrough and cure cancer. But no, he's come into his retirement completely convinced that what his experience in the health system in the US told him was that we have a real crisis of loneliness. And that, as Tracy says, has the potential to be a story of hope, because really it's our instincts telling us to reach out and connect with each other. I absolutely love this man. I can't recommend him more, and he has some brilliant interviews, including one with Brene Brown, which I highly recommend. So, as Catherine said in the chat box, this has been a blessing and a curse, this whole COVID situation. For some, it's been this period of great connection. We've been reaching out and we've been connecting with our neighbours and our family, and we've found deeper, meaningful connection. But for others, it's been incredibly isolating. 1 in 4 adults felt like they had no friends during lockdown. And the over 70s, 16 to 24-year-olds were much more lonely than any other age group. That said, as I said, Brits who believed that we look after each other really rose from February to May. And although those stats are dropping off, what we've seen from people like Hilary Cottam and other brilliant women who I'm sure you've all heard of, but her book about relationships is absolutely brilliant. She talked a lot about how the new forms of support, which are basically the kind of new relationships and the neighbourly things that people have done together, are sort of new forms of support that are not about fixing each other. They're about taking care and forging bonds of connection. And that's where, as we come into this final bit, I'm going to throw you some ideas and some inspirational examples of the way in which people are going beyond delivering services, and they're going beyond doing to people, and much more into the space of building like mutual and reciprocal relationships that are all focused on how you kind of build stronger, better connected, and ultimately less lonely communities. And this is all in the context, as you know, and as Abergavenny Street Monitors said in the chat box, their mutual aid group has been an extraordinary force during this time. And in the first poll, 71% of you said that you'd spoken to neighbours in the last week, which is an extraordinary uplift. It's not perhaps as much as it might have been in the middle of lockdown, but it is an extraordinary uplift, because in 2018, Skipton Building Society said that 68% of Brits described their neighbours as strangers. So we are at this moment of potential. We're at this inflection point. We have the ability perhaps to take some of the energy that's bubbled up through COVID and the relationships that have been formed during this period of crisis and harness them for us and our communities in the long run. So here are some examples. I don't know how long I'll have left, Flo, so I'm just going to whip through them. So the first one is the Cares family, based in London, Liverpool, Manchester. They bring together younger people and older people. They call everyone neighbours, and what they do is they create fun, engaging ways for people to learn new things and through that build relationships. But it's not a lonely club. It's not like, come here if you've just moved to London or Manchester and you feel a bit lonely. Come here if you're an older person who's lived in this neighbourhood for ages and it's gentrified and you don't know anyone. There's none of that. It's dance parties and pub quizzes, and it's absolutely fantastic. And after 8 years of work, they've really showed how building kind of mutual and reciprocal relationships can really change people's well-being and shift people's perceptions of themselves and the communities they belong to. Then there's Little Village. This takes two groups that live side by side but seldom interact. They're like kind of extremely wealthy parents in London, and then there's extreme deprivation and they live side by side in communities. And what Little Village does is it does do a sort of baby bank. It provides kind of material support for families who might not have enough to like get by, but actually it's much more than that. Around that, they build these incredible ways for people to come together and get to know each other and build relationships. And what starts with perhaps a need for some nappies or a pushchair can result in like long-term relationships growing between parents who live side by side but up until that moment had no excuse to interact. Then there's this wonderful man on this call called Ben Thurman at Carnegie up in Scotland. He's a trustee for Edinburgh Garden Partners. Again, how do you fix the fact that there will be some people who have a garden but don't know or don't feel capable of like making it nice or keeping it up to scratch, but then there are lots of people who don't have access to gardens, and this is all about matching those people up and giving them an excuse to come together and look after each other's gardens. But what starts with gardening ends in these brilliant relationships where people will go on to do lots of different things with each other. Then there's Grapevine in Coventry and Warwickshire. I'm going to keep whistling through because I know I'm running out of time. And then the Rural Coffee Caravan in Suffolk, which I'm a trustee for, and basically creates social spaces in rural places where basically there's nothing left, like a village shop or a pub or anywhere where people can gather. And with that relational deficit comes like extreme loneliness and isolation. And instead, what they do is they create social spaces which then go on to see the village hall being fixed up or community shops being set up. And that's all because it starts with relationships. How do you bring people together and give them a cup of tea and get them chatting? And it's amazing what then happens. Finally, Xenia brings together women in London, women to share languages, women who have recently arrived or for whatever reason don't speak particularly good English, with women who speak very good English. And they have these sort of language sessions, but it's totally not. There's a theme every week and they just sit down and they have a chat and they learn about different cultures. And during COVID in particularly, there's been some fantastic support going on in this network of women where people have been picking each other up from hospital and various other bits and pieces. So 4 things I'd like to leave you with. All of this work has these things in common, and that you, as brilliant people of Leeds who are doing amazing things to build relationships and connections, and you're looking perhaps, and actually we are way beyond Leeds, but you're looking perhaps at like the Abergavenny Mutual Aid Group, at like all of these new relationships, and you're thinking, what do we do with this? How do we harness this for the future? So my tips, but actually, as I say, they're not mine, they're all of these amazing people who do all this brilliant work. They would say, number 1, focus on shared experiences, gardening, food, dance parties, pub quizzes. Don't set up a lonely club. Like, give people something that they can do together that will bring them meaning. Focus on mutual benefit and reciprocity. What are the ways that you can create an experience that people can do together rather than having like someone be done to, because that is all rooted in how you shift power and encourage people to have agency. And then use language deliberately. None of those people talk about beneficiaries and service users and that kind of transactional language. It's all about neighbours and connection. And I think that that really does make a huge difference to the way people engage in the sorts of work that we're talking about. And the final thing is, obviously, and this is what's brilliant about Kinder Leeds, is to work collaboratively. It's not just up to the voluntary sector or the people who are maybe the usual suspects who always organise things in and around churches or community centres. It's going to need everyone. So think about how you can work with anyone, from the local Tesco's to perhaps the person on your street that you don't think would ever be involved. All of the kind of ways in which you can build sustainable change starts because you're thinking about how you work collaboratively. So I'll stop now, but thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Iona. And again, invite everyone to shower Iona with appreciation in whatever form feels right to you. I really enjoyed so many insights in that presentation that you've shared, and the examples are really powerful, and also the insights that you drew from them at the end really useful for others on this call who I know are doing community work in their own locations, like you say. We're going to move on now to the Q&A section of our evening. So Tracy and Iona have shared some really inspiring presentations earlier this evening, and I know that some of you have already asked questions in the chat box, but now's the chance, if you've got a question that's come from Tracy or Iona's presentation, and or from perhaps it's arisen during the breakout room discussions. We have got kind of 15 or 20 minutes now to check in with Tracy and Iona on all of your questions. So I know a few have come in already, so I'm going to hand over to my colleague at the Network of Wellbeing, Roger, to just share a few of the questions that have been coming in so that we can put them to Iona and Tracy.
Okay, I'll just unmute make sure I'm unmuted. Yes, I am. Okay, great stuff. Okay, we've got about 4 questions so far, but I'll keep an eye on for the other ones that are coming in. I think the first one I was going to ask was from Katrina. Iona, you mentioned loads and loads of books. Where can we get these books that are mentioned? And can we have a book list maybe at the end that you could circulate of things we ought to be reading?
I'd love to. Yes, I have a reading list, which I can share with Flo, and maybe it can go in the roundup email.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Angela from Leeds asked, loneliness is an inner feeling. Some people feel lonely in a crowded room. What can we do to invite people to connect with others? Maybe both of you want to come to that one.
I think that's the big issue, and I think that actually getting that is really important, that actually you can be surrounded by people but still feel incredibly lonely. The only way, like I said, we all find reasons to bump into people and connect, and I think the simplest thing is about talking to people, creating conversations and listening. That's the simplest thing you can do. To be honest, the simplest thing you can do is look at someone and let them know they've been seen by someone else and say hello. So the simplest thing for some people is actually, I have seen you. I've seen you this evening, Hazel and Gloria and Katrina. Do you know? And I say hello. You know, I've seen you this evening. And that is a very simple thing. I think listening and having conversations. Loneliness, you can't quickly fix it. It's friendships and relationships that fix loneliness. So it's about being there with people while they build up relationships. And it might not be with you, it might be with others, that enables them to stop feeling so lonely. I also think most people, because loneliness has been stigmatized so much, that they don't think of it as such a creative space. And actually, if you think about healing therapies when people have mental health issues, when people are recovering, it's the same for loneliness. It can be a really creative space. I mean, I only write a poem if I'm miserable. There's no happy poems from me, people. I don't share them, but that is what I do. So I would say, just find as many opportunities and some different ways that just bring people together and make the most of those. Well, we don't have many bumping into spaces now, but make the most of every opportunity, any event throughout the year, whether it be Harvest or Halloween or Christmas or Diwali or Chinese New Year, any reason to bring people together and start putting those touch points in the year. Will really help people start building relationships and building confidence as well. Iona, do you want to add to that? What's a human library? Oh, I've just seen that. One of my favourite things.
I'll only very quickly add that when Tracy and I first worked together in 2017 on the Great Get Together / Big Lunch, at that moment in time, an estimated 9 million people reached out and had kind of spent time in their community over the course of a weekend, and that was an unprecedented number. And when we did the M&E together, people consistently said that there was something around Joe and something around the kind of the context. It was shortly after the Manchester bombing and also the London Bridge attack and also Grenfell. And what we consistently heard from people was like, they'd been looking for an excuse. And I think what we hear a lot of, for those of us who are like do lots of this work, and you must have seen it also yourselves, is that most of the time people don't not want to do this, but they need an excuse to, and that excuse can be really small, even if it feels quite scary. So the thing about COVID was, you know, we all, or at least I did, you know, some leafleting in my local area, and I only got one text message, and like that's quite like scary. So it's not meant to be easy. Like strangers, you know, stranger danger is real. It's a survival instinct. But if you can overcome or like have courage in that moment and reach out and find an excuse, then like things will unfold from there. And so finding the excuse is the key, I think.
Yeah, and I do think that neighbourhood next door, if you've got neighbours, not everybody has, is quite key. So what you find is that's scarier, and I'm hoping COVID has reduced that. So knocking on your neighbour's door is actually scarier than going to a community group or going to an allotment, because actually you can pick and choose when you go. There's a real fear factor that, oh, if I knock on my neighbour's door, will they become needy? Will they, you know, what if they, you know, do the heading? What if they reject me? So actually breaking down those barriers is key. And I'm really hoping that COVID has done that for a lot of people. And for many it will not. But we have to sort of try ride that wave of connection.
Oh, okay, that's great. There's a whole load of questions, and I'm going to go sort of to the first group. There's JL from Hare Hills asks, because he really likes the Cares family idea, what are the first steps in putting together something like that? And Sam asks, could Iona or Tracy share their top tips and expand on ideas for intergenerational work like the Cares family that's already been mentioned?
Yeah, I'll happily have a go with that. I'll again, part of some of the stuff that I'll give Flo to send round is some things that the Cares family have written about that sort of work. The thing that the Cares family do that I think is really special is they start by, they don't pretend that they're there to replace the NHS or there to replace other services or support networks for older people or even younger people who might be isolated in the community. The Cares family are just trying to be some of the glue that stick things together. So at the very start, like with all good community work, but so often it's not done properly, they do sort of 6 to 12 months of listening and learning every time they set up a new network in a local community. And that's really about building partnerships with everyone from universities to Age UK to really build the trust of the community, because people who are isolated and lonely are less likely to trust people. And so this new person or group coming in being like, we're going to hold fun clubs and dance classes, you're much more likely to go to something if that message or invitation comes from someone you trust. So yeah, their first step is always to work in partnership and collaborate with people in the community. And then they start by like asking what people want to do. And so one of my favorite kind of examples is Desert Island Discs, which is where everyone's invited to come to most of the time a hall, but it's obviously been happening, or not obviously, it's been happening on Zoom over lockdown. And people can share their favourite records and share stories about why it's their favourite record. It might be the thing they danced their first dance to at their wedding. It might remind them of a particular moment. And then everyone has a boogie. Yeah, just that came from the fact that someone in a network in North London really liked that show, and that was their idea. But I'll share some of the things that they've written, and their CEO Alex Smith is a pretty cool guy who's done some pretty inspirational things, so I'll make sure that that's included in the newsletter after this, because I think it's very inspiring.
Excellent. And just to briefly add on a very practical note, we're going to include the slides that were shared in Tracy and Iona's presentations earlier, so that everyone has that information as well. So you're going to have a bumper email of resources. But yeah, sorry, Tracy.
No, it's okay. Was the second half of that top tips, Roger?
Yeah, it was top tips for sort of setting up the sort of meetings that the Cares family have been doing, intergenerational work. So
I think it's really interesting. I like to try think of multi-generational work. And again, it's because of the language you use. So as soon as we start saying intergenerational work, people think of your most your elderly and your youngest, which is lovely and it's enlightening, and the connections are beautiful. But I think what we need is thinking about multi-generational. So I'm just still in my 40s till next year. You know, how do I connect with someone in their 60s or 70s, do you know, or somewhere in their 20s? And actually we must think about all the generations. I've heard lots of people talk about the digital divide and the fears of the disconnection and losing older people getting online. And I think that's really real. Nobody's talking the fact that we were already worried about the amount of young people spending lots of time online, and actually they've now got permission to have less real life relationships. You know what I mean? So it's about all those things. It's really complex. And I think, you know, we've got to consider it in a real broad, big picture type of thing. We also have a partnership with the Food for Life program that's all about trying to get different generations together over food, and there's sort of Grandparents Gardening Week, the big lunch of course, and then coming up is World Food Day. So if anybody's interested in bringing people together, they do have some pilot areas and there's small grants available, but of course I'm going to say bring people together over food, but there's lots of things about talking to people and learning, but thinking of the multi-generations, only because our understanding of intergenerational or others is really those extremes, and actually we need to be working in all levels for some sustainability.
Are we ready for another round?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, you've got time. Okay, there's a whole series of questions about particular initiatives, and I ought to say at this point there are so many questions, Flo, I'm not sure we're going to be able to get them all in, but we'll just keep on going. Hazel has asked, has anyone tried human libraries? We're planning to try one here in Cinema & Co in Swansea. Jeremy is interested in the concept of collision spaces as ways of creating emergent connections. Any experience with this on the panel? And Sophia is interested in creativity, well-being and mental health. Have we got any suggestions or advice on the way to encourage people to support each other using those techniques?
Thanks, Roger. Would Iona or Tracy like to come in on that first? Oh, Tracy, you're muted. Yeah.
Sorry, I was replying to a chat thing. Could you repeat that, please, Roger?
Okay, there's about 3 questions, Tracy.
I heard something about creativity and mental health, but I'm not really good at multitasking.
Creativity and mental health, human libraries and collision spaces.
So we did a beautiful report just before lockdown about closing the distance. We weren't prepared to then having to separate 2 meters apart. But that was all about those bumping into spaces that people create. So your supermarkets, the benches outside shops, your green spaces and all those sort of things. So people often think that they need building or community centres or things to come together, and we know that there's loads of community garden projects and allotment projects and stores and village shops, and our pub became a hub during COVID. So how do we make the most of those spaces? The human library is a lovely thing. And we've got a festival coming at the beginning of November, and the human library is literally, you take out books of people. So I could be a human library book, and you could chat to me about community work or loneliness or being ginger or living in Leeds or why my banana loaf never works. You know, so it can be anything. There was also an amazing thing, which was trade school. So that really fits in where it's an online thing and people all bring something. So if you're doing cupcakes, people might bring the ingredients, or you might ask people to bring a smile or a joke. And I think this reciprocity, this people being equal, this thing that we all have something to share, we all have experience, we all have knowledge. If we can get away from this helper and helpless, or, you know, powerful and powerless, I think, you know, that's what creates kinder relationships and kinder communities and reduces loneliness, is this reciprocity. We all need to ask sometimes for something, and we all have something to give, every single one of us, and even if it's a smile, we can all do that.
Fantastic.
Very powerfully,
Not bad for not listening, really, Warren. Come on, pull down the bag there.
Would you like to add anything to that, Iona?
I've got a list of things that I think are kind of usefully inspiring. I think the collision spaces idea is really like something that I spent a lot of time thinking. I was muted, sorry. Collision spaces. There are things like, as Tracy said, pub is the hub, which takes some of the stuff that already happens. We know that there are spaces where people gather and they can collide, but how do you incentivize more of that in somewhere? And the charity that I'm a trustee for in rural Suffolk, the Rural Coffee Caravan, has this like brilliant like accreditation scheme called More Than a Shop, and for all of the local community shops that go above and beyond to create spaces that are welcoming and connecting, they have these like certificates, and it's now become this kind of like Suffolk thing where like there are all of these shops with like these More Than a Shop certificates, and it's really small, but what it does is creates a kind of an incentivization, and also kind of celebrates that quality and that value, and that goes a long way to then encourage more of it. But then there are obviously ways that you can create brand new spaces, and the friendly bench is definitely something that you might want to look up, but also things like playing out, which is the kind of nationwide scheme to get roads closed down for short periods of time so that people can come out onto the streets and meet. So there are lots of different ways of approaching it, but it's as much about creating new spaces as like radically transforming or kind of trying to co-opt existing spaces, whether they're shops or restaurants. Yeah, those are just a few examples I have.
That's brilliant, thank you, Iona. And just a practical point again to add that I know that there's been so much richness shared in the chat, and we will be saving the chat box and including that in the follow-up email as well, so that people have the links and discussions that have been shared as a resource. I think we've got time for one more round of questions before we move to kind of closing announcements, Roger. So I'll hand over to you again.
Okay, brilliant. Lisa asked, I think, quite an difficult question maybe, which is how can we address isolation and loneliness for those with neurodiverse conditions who find social connections very difficult? And then maybe to end, both Hazel, I think, and Avagweni asked for practical suggestions about reducing the stigma of being lonely, and what's the simplest way to make a difference?
Mm-hmm. Just touching on those social connections, I know that for some people actually this has really helped them make connections. So those people who struggle to go out in society or have things such as autism, and those connections actually fare better on screen, do you know, because they're still in their protected space. And actually the fact that there is more space between people helps some people feel safer, because they're not in their safe and they know what to expect. So there are some real advantages, but actually, to be fair, if you have a condition that actually means that you really struggle to build relationships and connections, it is incredibly difficult, which is why I think peer support groups is really important in that, but actually making sure that those peer support groups aren't just limited to one condition. So if you think we're all interdependent, but we all need different skills, and what you need is people with different skills in that group so that people can form friendships and relationships. And I think if that person is content, so what we also do is prejudge, or we project what we think their relationships or their life should or could be like. And I think you really have to try and get in the head of certain people and see actually are they content with what they've got or not. And that's the challenge if you don't experience it. So that's just something I wanted to say that. And there's sometimes where you actually need those support systems. You do need those support groups that help facilitate those particular relationships. We often hear people talk about hard to reach, and I don't think anyone's hard to reach. Some people are just a tad more resource intensive than others, and people decide where they're going to put their resources, and that's it and all about it. And now, because I got on the slight soapbox, I forgot the second half of that question. Is it simple, practical things?
Simple, practical things, and also
Reduce
ways
the
of reducing the stigma of being lonely.
Yeah. I think one of the biggest things I do is I talk about my loneliness. So I will share my experience, and I will share any experience that I've had if I think it will benefit. Not like Tourette's, I won't make you all listen to my life story, but I'm happy to share the things that I have got through. I'm also happy to support anybody who have experienced loneliness. And I think if you just make it open, and if you share that actually sometimes I feel lonely, I think if you really feel confident and you know someone, you could always say, oh, if that was me, I think I might be feeling a bit lonely, or how does that make you feel? I know that's a bit of a cliche question, but it is about listening to people, and it is about being open to hear. So when I did my presentation, I said, most of us don't ask because we're scared we're going to have to come up with a solution. We will all know someone who's lonely. Absolutely. We will all know someone who's lonely. And it's that old adage, problem shared is a problem half. We're not there to solve it. We can't for a lot of people, but we can listen to them, we can hear with them, and we can help them get through it. And I think that's it. And when I talk about, I hate, tackling loneliness, as I said, I like to think about reducing it, dealing with it, addressing it, living with it. And we often talk about people living with loneliness. And I think if we can start talking about that, it's really quite powerful. I think COVID's done a lot to reduce the stigma. But I think people are focusing on the isolation and not necessarily on the subjective feelings of loneliness.
And I'll just add that on the sort of neurodiversity question, the organisation that I didn't have enough time to talk through, but there's an organisation called Grapevine in Coventry. And for those of you who are familiar with it, they are a sort of asset-based community development organisation who focus on what people have and what they, rather than what they don't have. And they do brilliant, beautiful and completely transformative work, building relationships between everyone in Coventry and Warwickshire, but it did start out as an organisation that specifically worked with people with disabilities. And I'll share some beautiful content of some of the things they've done during lockdown, but the relationships that they are part of forging and forming in Coventry have seen people go from with quite debilitating neuro conditions, from being very housebound and isolated to going on to have careers in my favourite story is career in TV drama, and it was all to do with building the sort of warm web of relationships around that person that they needed in order to kind of fulfill their kind of potential. And the way that Coventry Grapevine do it is by creating spaces and places where people can connect and be on equal terms with one another, and it's completely transformative. And their conference during lockdown called Connecting for Good was a beautiful example where 200 people from across Coventry came together. So I highly recommend looking that up.
Thank you so much, Iona and Tracy, for those helpful responses, and thank you, Roger, for summarising the questions. Sorry that we're not going to have the time to go through all of the questions that have been asked this evening, but we wanted to save a few minutes at the end just to draw us to a close together and share some kind of takeaways, really. So thank you so much all for being a part of this interactive evening. It's been wonderful. What we thought is we would love to go back to Tracy and Iona just for a kind of takeaway message that they would like to emphasise from this evening's discussion. So either a message or an action, and then we'll just close with some announcements about getting involved with the rest of this series, because this was the first in a series of 3 events on community action for wellbeing. So I'll share some about that at the end, but I'll hand over to Tracy for your closing remarks first.
I just want to echo that and thank you all, and I think you all can be rest assured that you are kind people who are already reducing loneliness. So just by learning and understanding it, your own or another's, I think is really, really important, and sometimes it's hard to recognise our own internal feelings, and it's quite easy to support others. So I just think, you know, if anybody is feeling lonely, honestly, I will happily talk to anybody, but there are lots of people out there who can support you. Talk to someone about it. Do not feel ashamed. You know, admit to yourself, because often, you know, we struggle to find the words of how we're feeling. So I just, I want to say you're all loved, but I do genuinely think you are all really kind human beings that have took the time out to learn more about this issue and others. And so big thank you for that.
Thanks, Tracy. It's like you can tell you love hugs because it's like a verbal hug listening to what you share there. And Iona, handing over to you.
You should all meet Tracy. She's a seriously good hugger. So I will finish, I think, by returning to what I think is kind of, I think we're at this turning point, and I said this already, and Tracy did too, and I think it's come up lots in the breakout rooms as well. We're at this turning point, whether it's, you know, there's another stat that I love is that you're more likely to knock on your neighbours' doors in the first 2 years of living in a house than you are in the subsequent 20. So there are these moments where the context in which people build relationships and they connect with one another in their community, where that context shifts. And I think this is one of those moments, but we must remember that it's not forever and that the window will close. And so even in the smallest possible ways, whether it's setting up the WhatsApp group that might not have got set up during COVID, whether it's thinking about what you might do as winter approaches to organise even a small get-together at Christmas to like incentivise your street or your building through the next few months. Like the small things, the absolutely simplest small things right now that you can do to like harness the power of the connections and the transition moment we're at will have the potential to be kind of harvested, I suppose, in the coming years. So don't think that anything is too small. Like, do find those small moments of connection and find ways to bring people together, because what you do now, I think, will have a really profound impact in the future. And just to draw your attention again to that thing that I said earlier, which is 71% of you have spoken to neighbours in the last week, which is extraordinary. That's amazing. Like that hasn't been the norm before this year. And we know that that before this, 68% described their neighbours as strangers. So hold on to that feeling and overcome the nervousness that you might have about doing the small things, because if you can harness and bottle some of that for the future, I think we stand a chance at working our way towards the sort of world that, like Joe definitely wanted, where we all do believe that we have more in common and we look out for each other and we are less lonely as a country.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry. Thank you so much, Iona. That's also a really powerful way to close. And thank you so much, everyone, for being such an engaged and kind audience this evening. So yeah, we'd love to invite you to continue this discussion in the rest of the events in this series. So we're actually going to have 2 further events. One will be, I'm going to put all of the details in the chat now so you guys have them accessible and available, although hopefully you will have got them in the registration email as well. So on the 22nd of September, so on Tuesday evening in 2 weeks' time, we're going to be looking at resilient communities, caring for ourselves and caring for each other. And we're going to have a range of inspiring speakers for that event. And then on the 6th of October, so again, it's going to be every other Tuesday evening for the coming weeks, we'll be exploring how does nature connection support community wellbeing. So you can click on those sign up links. This will also be sent to you in the follow-up email, but we do really encourage you guys to join us again, because it really helps to deepen our discussions and strengthen the work that we're doing in communities to connect in this way. And we'd love to, if you've got any feedback, I'm just going to put a link to our kind of feedback survey from the event this evening. If you want to share how your experience has been. And yeah, the final thing that I would love to do is take a screenshot of everyone participating in the event this evening, if you feel comfortable. So if you would like to be involved, love to have your camera on and wave or smile. If you would prefer not to be, feel free to turn your camera off. Roger's doing his hair and his beard. I will just take a few screenshots now and then you'll see them. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you, guys. And just a final word of thanks. Thank you so much to Eden Project Community for co-hosting this series with us, the Network of Wellbeing. Thank you for the kind of Leeds folks for including this event and the next one in the series as part of your amazing series of events. And thank you so much, Tracy and Iona, for sharing so much wisdom with us this evening. And thanks all of you guys for being a part of it.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting, Flo. I think it's my turn next. So
yes, yeah,
really,
so final closing announcement.
Yeah, we're really looking forward to seeing you over the next couple of weeks. I think Claire has also popped in the chat some of our community Facebook group if people are interested in their community. And also we've just opened our virtual community camp, which is an online course that people are welcome to join if you're interested in connection with others and you've got an idea or you want to develop your project. That is what we do. We have a network of community-led activists, volunteers, and just generally kind people across the UK. And that's usually the way people start to find out about us. So just to let you know about those few things if you're interested in engaging further. But don't forget the next 2 sessions because I shall be looking forward to seeing some of you there.
Thanks, Tracy.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a good rest of your evening. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.